trips me up sometimes is you got two switches that have to be on. All right, we are towards the end of Exodus chapter 2. We're going to be doing just a little bit of recap in Exodus 2, because we're at the end of this section where the text is laying out for us all the ways in which Israel is afflicted in Egypt. And so we start with the kind of the broad strokes. That this new king has come in who does not know Joseph. He's paranoid, he's afraid that Israel is going to rise up, that they're going to basically be part of an insurrection against Egypt, and that they're going to skedaddle. But his main concern, the first thing that he is concerned about in Exodus 1:10 is, he says, "Let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." All right, he's already seen that they have multiplied, that they've become very numerous, and he wants that to stop. And so we've traced how through all of these schemes where Pharaoh is trying to stop them from multiplying, it actually just makes the matter worse. And as we've gone along, we've seen how the narrative has gotten more specific. All right, so it starts just broadly talking about Israel, how they're all enslaved, how they are put under heavy burdens. But the more they were oppressed, this is Exodus 1:12, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. All right, so that plan's a failure. Second plan is to have the Hebrew midwives murder the infant males, and they refuse to do it. They act shrewdly with Pharaoh on account of it. And so, Exodus 1:20, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. All right, so we know generally Israel is continuing to multiply, but specifically, because the midwives feared God, he gave them families as well. All right, so the ones that are obeying God, the ones that fear God, are specifically rewarded with increase, with multiplying. And then in chapter 2, it gets really specific. All right, this Levite man takes a Levite woman as his wife, and she conceives and bears a son, which of course makes him subject to Pharaoh's third scheme. At the end of chapter 1, verse 22, Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile," that is, into the river, "but you shall let every daughter live." And last time we were together, we looked at all of the irony built into Exodus chapter 2, and just how shrewd Moses' family was in dealing with Pharaoh. How Moses is supposed to be put to death by being cast into the river, and instead, what Moses' mother does is she saves him by putting him in the river in this basket. So he's supposed to be cast into the river to die, but then later Pharaoh's own daughter thwarts his intent by drawing him up out of the river and not throwing him back in once she realizes that this is one of the Hebrews' children, as she says at the end of chapter 2, verse 6. And of course we see how shrewd Moses' sister was. In verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. So in other words, the Levite woman gets to keep her son and gets to nurse her son, gets to raise him for a little bit at least, probably a couple or 3 years. That's, of course, what all mothers naturally do, except in this instance, she gets paid to do it. What's supposed to happen is she loses her son. Instead, she gets to keep her son and gets paid to raise him, which, again, is just extraordinarily shrewd on their part. So whenever he gets a little older, verse 10, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because he said, I drew him out of the water. Of course, capping off all of the irony here. He's supposed to be cast into the water, but instead he's drawn out of the water. And that's where he gets his very name, from the very daughter of Pharaoh. All right, so that brings us to, we finished up on Sunday with verses 11 through 15. And we noted, and should note again, that in between verses 10 and 11, there's probably a good, hour's worth of feature film for you to watch, right? If you're watching the Ten Commandments, or if you're watching the Prince of Egypt, or I think literally any adaptation of the Ten Commandments. This is probably true of VeggieTales too. There's a lot of extra information thrown in about Moses' upbringing in Pharaoh's court. We don't get any of that here. Instead, in verse 11, we go straight from him being, a very young child who has just weaned, straight to verse 11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. All right, and this whole text has been about the affliction of Israel in Egypt. And Moses goes out and he sees it. And how does he react to it?
He was angry.
Yeah, and he strikes down the Egyptian. He strikes the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. That's what we read in verse 12. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Which, all of this foreshadows what we're going to read about what God is doing. Right? And we know ultimately Moses is going to be God's representative among the sons of Israel. Here we get some forecasting of that. Because, again, in verse 11, we see that Moses looks on the people and saw their burdens, saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. We're going to learn at the end of the chapter, let's see, that God likewise is going to see his people. In fact, the very last verse of chapter 2, verse 25, God saw the people of Israel. All right, specifically what we read in the previous verse, verse 24, God heard their groaning, all right, because they had been enslaved. All right, so God sees them and God knew. All right, in other words, God is about to act on their behalf. Well, likewise, we see Moses seeing what's happening to his people, and he acts. He strikes down the Egyptian, and then we're told he's hid in the sand. He's buried. He's not ever coming back. And this is, I think, a special little bit of foreshadowing, because what do we know ultimately God is going to do to the Egyptians? He's going to strike them down, and he's going to bury a great deal of them, both in the 10th plague and in the Red Sea crossing. So all of this is looking forward to what is going to happen. All right, but we get to some conflict in chapter 2, verse 13. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, Why do you strike your companion? He answered, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? This likewise, by the way, is looking forward. Because ultimately, whenever God brings the sons of Israel out of Egypt and starts to deliver them to the promised land, well, what's their reaction to God? They're constantly going to be challenging him. Right, and we'll read that later in the book. But the reaction here to Moses is exactly the same as what the reaction is going to be later to God himself. And of course, this question is kind of ironic. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? This hasn't actually happened yet in the text, but ultimately we know that there is an answer to this. Right? Yeah. I mean, and in fact, that's going to be the very next thing that we read starting in chapter 3. Now, Moses doesn't know this yet. This Hebrew doesn't know this yet. But of course, we know where this is all tending. And in fact, Stephen the martyr in his sermon in Acts 7 makes kind of a big deal out of this. It's part of his sermon on how the people of God have always resisted God's messengers. They've always persecuted the prophets. Right? They've always slain God's messengers, and they never listen. And this is one of his first prime examples in that sermon, is this Hebrew rejecting Moses. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? All right, but the result of this is that Moses is afraid, and he thinks, surely this thing is known. So when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And that's where we ended last time, with him sitting by the well, which of course, as we continue to draw connections between the Exodus story and what we have already read in Genesis, him running out to a foreign land, afraid for his life, and then sitting down next to a well. I mean, all of this should remind us of which one of the patriarchs? Jacob, because it's exactly what Jacob does. He fears for his life. It's told him that Esau is going to kill him, and so he runs off to Padan Aram, and he goes to a well, and that is where he finds Rachel. All right, so that's going to bring us to our text where we're at in Exodus chapter 2, verse 16. Any questions or comments before we pray and jump into the text tonight? All right, let's bow together. Righteous Father, thank you for the great gifts that you've given us tonight. Thank you for our time together to study from your word. And Father, I pray that as we study about your servant Moses and what you do through him for your people, that you help us, Father, to recognize the work that you have set aside for us. Help us, Father, to recognize our own stubbornness and willfulness, our own reluctance to serve, and help us, Father, to correct that and to serve you well. And Father, we also see the mercy and the graciousness that you show towards your people, and we are so thankful that you show that same mercy and grace toward us, your children, through Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, verse 16. Excuse me. Let's see. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." All right, let's stop here for just a second. Because as we're considering these parallels, if Moses in this situation is supposed to make us think of Jacob, then where would our minds just kind of automatically go in thinking about Reuel? Who would be, Laban. Now, hold this in mind, all right, because sometimes the text will draw these parallels to have us compare people. Sometimes they'll draw these parallels to have us contrast people. All right, so what this sets us up to do is to start comparing and contrasting Reuel, this Midianite priest, to Laban. How's he stack up? How do they compare? And we'll see, I think, pretty quickly how that is going to go. The other thing that we should note at this point, by the way, is that this man is a priest. And if we read just one more verse, verse 21, Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. All right, that should do a couple of things for us. We'll pursue the Laban comparison in just a second. But we should also notice another comparison that the text is inviting us to make. Moses has gone to a foreign land and is marrying into a family of priests. He's marrying the daughter of a priest. Which of the patriarchs does that remind us of? Joseph. Yeah, because remember, while he's in Egypt, he marries the daughter of a priest. All right, so all kinds of just little comparisons that the text is bringing to mind for us. All of this for a reason. But whenever we read in verse 21 that Moses was content to dwell with the man, and that the man gave Moses his daughter Zipporah for a wife, how does this compare to Jacob dwelling with Laban? All right, yeah, that's... He had to work for it. Yeah, I mean, just think of how much...
Really, to get the wife he wants.
Yeah, well, and he ended up spending a total of, I think, about 20 years in Paddan Aram. Because not only does he stay to work for, the wife that he really wants, but then whenever he's ready to leave, remember, Laban convinces him to stay a little bit longer in exchange for part of the flocks. And remember, that's another example of where Laban is trying to fleece Jacob. And he says, well, this time you're only going to get the spotted and speckled out of the flock. Well, now this time you're only going to get the striped. And ultimately, we know that God is with Jacob. Jacob knows that God is with him. And he prospers him. All right. Now, in this case, and remember, in Jacob's case, just how much of the text of Genesis that whole mess took up. Right? It starts back in Genesis 29 and runs all the way through chapter 31. And those are long chapters too. They are not short chapters. Quite a lot of text dealing with Jacob's sojourns in Paddan Aram, and all the difficulty that he has with his uncle, who is also his father-in-law, in trying to be treated well. In Moses' case, we get one verse. The whole thing is wrapped up in one verse. Moses was content to dwell with the man. How's that compare to Jacob, by the way? Yeah, he's not content. He only dwells because he has to begin with. Then he tries to escape once, and Laban, kind of catches him in the act and says, no, stay with me, I'll pay you. And Jacob kind of reluctantly agrees to stick around. And whenever he finally goes to leave the second time, after Joseph has been born, remember, he packs everything up and he's basically sneaking out in the middle of the night. Right? He wants to escape, and escape is exactly the right word for it, because Laban wants to keep him around, right? And Laban chases him down. All of that stuff, keep in mind, by the way. Moses, on the other hand, does not feel any need to escape from him. He's content to live with him, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. And that's it. There's no, oh, it's the wrong daughter. Oh, he said, we don't do it this way. We marry out our older daughters first. Work for me another 7 years. There's none of that. There's no labor at all. He just gets Zipporah as his wife. And she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. All right. At this point, we should stop to note that the name Gershom is really, really important. And the son is going to be fairly important as well. In fact, we're going to see some really interesting things happen around Gershom. His name is significant because Moses recognizes who he is, just like all of the patriarchs recognize who they are. Moses identifies himself in exactly the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob identify themselves. We might remember, since it's been pretty recent, whenever Joseph takes Jacob and stands him before Pharaoh, what does Jacob call himself? A sojourner, yeah. The days of the years of my sojourn, he says, have been 130. And I've not lived as long as my fathers, so it's really bad. But he identifies himself as a sojourner, just like the rest of the patriarchs do. And Moses identifies himself so thoroughly as a sojourner. I have been a sojourner in a foreign land, that he names his son Sojourner. All right, that would be the English equivalent of it. Yeah, a lot of these Hebrew names, there's not really a good, like we wouldn't name, well, like with Benjamin, we wouldn't name any of our sons right hand. Right? Or, well, it's more than that. Benjamin means son of my right hand. Right? None of us would name our sons son of my right hand. It's a mouthful. And if he's in trouble, you want something nice and short, right? But here there is an English equivalent, sojourner. His son's name is Sojourner. And it's the major theme of the book, because that's what Israel is going to be doing over the course of not just this book, but the next 3 books as well, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. It is true in the moment for Moses. He, in this moment, in this place, in Midian, is a sojourner in a foreign land. But it's always been true for Moses, for the same reasons that it's always been true for the sons of Israel, and for their fathers going all the way back to Abraham. All right, so as we read through all of this, just notice how many texts about God's presence and about his deliverance have been tied together in these 2 chapters. All right, so we've noted a few things. Let's just make a short list just to refresh our memories. As we've gone through the text, we've noted, well, here, let's just label this God's deliverance, or God's presence. Or honestly, we could even label it God's promise. All right, so we've seen the repetition of be fruitful and multiply. We've seen how Israel has done that while they are in Egypt. We've had that reference that, again, is all over Genesis, and we've seen it several times in the Exodus account. We've had allusions to Noah in the flood, because remember, when Moses is put in the basket in the river, it's described in very much the same way as Noah's Ark, and it's supposed to make us think of Noah's Ark. So we've had that brought up. We've had Abraham brought up in all kinds of ways, especially in his dealings with Abimelech. Because remember, we've had, like Pharaoh is concerned about how much Israel is multiplying. Well, Abimelech was likewise concerned, and God was with Abraham in that. We have seen it, and we're about to see another big, here, we'll call this 3B. Another big comparison with Abraham at Mount Moriah. All right, we've got another big one coming up. We've already seen some allusions to it in the text. We've seen allusions to Abraham finding a wife for Isaac. Let me see if we've got a better marker here. Here we go. All right, we've in fact had that in this chapter. Because Jacob is not the only one who goes to Paddan Aram and stops at a well and finds a wife. Remember, Abraham's servant does that. I want to say in Genesis 24, makes the same journey, arrives at a well, and that's where he finds Rebekah. All right, we've also seen Isaac with Abimelech. We have seen, like we've talked about tonight, some reminders of Jacob with Laban. And we've had reminders also of Joseph. Because remember, one of the big themes of Joseph's story And again, whether we think he's faithful or unfaithful during this period, remember the reason he names his sons the way he names them. Let's see, if we go to Genesis 41, let's see. Yeah, verse 52. The name of the second son he called Ephraim. And of course, we know how important Ephraim is. But here's the meaning of the name. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Right? Like Joseph recognizes that Egypt is the land of his affliction. Even in the midst of him being promoted to the second highest rank in all of Egypt. Being the most powerful man in the country after Pharaoh. Joseph recognizes that he has been through a lot of trouble in Egypt. All right, so all of these things being tied together here just in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. All right, our text is wanting us to think of all of the covenant promises that God has made throughout Genesis. All of the covenant deliverance that God has achieved throughout Genesis. And how it is all kind of pointing forward and being culminated in God's work with Israel. Right, it's kind of like all coming to a head at this point. Everything that he's done. So, of course, that brings us to the last passage in Exodus chapter 2. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry of rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And I should note, by the way, as I was reading that, it occurred to me, the ESV uses, honestly, I don't know, it may be for clarity's sake, it may be a political correctness thing, I'm not sure. But like in verse 23 and verse 25, it uses the people of Israel. Every time you see the people of Israel, or in the King James, the children of Israel, it is always literally the sons of Israel. Right, that's what they're referred to as, the sons of Israel. That's the theme of the whole book. That's the title of the book. These are the names of the sons of Israel. So we're told that God sees the sons of Israel. The sons of Israel are groaning because of their slavery. They cry out for help. Their cry comes up to God. God heard their groaning, and specifically, God remembered, not as if he forgot, right? It's not like, I left a whole people in the oven, right? That's not what God's saying to himself. It's that God is now attending to these covenant promises and is about to take action on them. We've seen how this language of remembering and forgetting is very much about either attending something or neglecting something. God remembered specifically his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Right, again, all of these covenant promises are coming together. God saw the sons of Israel, and God knew. And that brings us into a new section, chapters 3 and 4, where God is going to start doing something about it. So we've laid all the groundwork for the affliction. Any questions or comments before we break into chapter 3? Wayne?
Do we know, scientists, reason why what Pharaoh Moses was doing?
It's a debated point. I've heard a few names tossed around. It's not really something that I have dug into, though, personally. Yeah, I mean, if you read, or not if you read, like if you're watching the Ten Commandments, for example, where it's Ramses, and that was like a really popular interpretation for a long, long time. But there's a lot of disagreement about even the date of the Exodus, which would change what pharaoh that would be. Mm-hmm.
There's a documentary called Atoms of Evidence.
Okay.
The Exodus goes into that, like it actually happened about 150, maybe 200 years earlier.
Yeah, I mean, there is all kinds of debate about, like whenever you look at people making claims about the date of the Exodus, it will range anywhere from like close to around 1500 BC at the far end to like close to 1100 BC. I mean, there's like a huge gap just depending on who's doing the conjecturing. So, not the kind of thing that I have really dug into. But it's a good question. Any other questions or comments? I tell you, that would be something for a third Sunday Q&A. Let me write it down. Okay. All right, so let's start chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. All right, so let's do a little exercise here. As we've been going through the text, we've seen all of these places where it is alluding back to the story, especially the stories of the patriarchs in Genesis. What kinds of details have you noticed here in these first 5 verses that you remember from Genesis? What kinds of parallels can we put together? Got one, Wayne? Okay, Abraham and Isaac going to Mount Moriah specifically in Genesis 22. That's a good one. That's a really important one. What all reminds us of Mount Moriah here in these first 5 verses? We're talking about the sacrifice of Isaac here. What kinds of little cues do we get? All right, he's at the mountain of God, and so we're talking about a different mountain here. Horeb and Moriah are not the same mountain. But one of the things that we read about the mountain, and we should notice in both cases they are at mountains, but after the whole ordeal in Genesis 22 is done, in verse 14, so Genesis 22:14, so Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Right, on the mountain of God. Yeah, on the mountain of Adonai, it will be provided. Right, because Moriah here is identified as the mountain of God, because that's where Abraham goes to meet God, and that's where God provides for him. Right, here in Exodus, we're just told that that Horeb is the mountain of God. And it's one of these things that just kind of comes out of nowhere. We're not given any explanation for it. Just that he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. What other things? All right, well, what's the burning bush remind us of? Okay, so specifically looking at like the presence of the Lord, we do see a few places where he appears to Abraham. Like, remember in the night visions that Abraham has, God has had Abraham cut open, the carcasses of several animals and lay them out, and God passes as like a smoking fire pot in this vision. He passes between the animals because he's cutting a covenant with Abraham. So yeah, that's a good comparison. The Lord appearing as a flame of fire, which of course we know also is looking forward to the way that he's going to appear to all Israel. Right? Good. What other things might remind us of Abraham on the mountain of the Lord? What about the way that God calls Moses and the way that he responds? This is a really distinctive thing that we've only seen a couple of times. Yeah, so Moses turns aside to see, and in verse 4, when the Lord saw that, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," and his response is, "Here I am." All right, that's Abraham's famous response from Genesis 22. Right? In fact, that's how the whole situation starts out in Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." All right, and then the same thing happens again as Abraham is in the midst of the sacrifice, about to kill his son. In verse 11, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham!' And he said, 'Here I am.'" Right, we've noticed this kind of responsiveness out of Abraham that we are now seeing in Moses as God is revealing himself to Moses. We also see, by the way, the presence of the angel of the Lord. We just saw it in Genesis 22. That second time, it's the angel of the Lord calling from heaven. Here in Exodus 3, verse 2, it's the angel of the Lord who appears to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. All of that we can see paralleled in Genesis chapter 22. So, just think back to what you remember. Oh, Dennis, go ahead.
Is there any relation between Abraham and Moses saying, "Here I am," and God calling himself "I am"? Is there any connection there?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, not like in English it kind of works linguistically. In Hebrew, it's something closer to like "behold me." Yeah, that's what we have translated as "here I am." Wayne?
Totally unrelated topic. I'm wondering if, it says here, west side of the wilderness, people are at the mountaintop, that comment there, could it possibly be looking back, since Moses is writing this much later?
Mm-hmm.
He knows there's a mountain that's called the Mountain of God. We named that later, so
Yeah, I mean, it's the mountain of the Lord in the same way that Moriah is the mountain of the Lord. Mainly in that that's the mountain where the Lord was, right? that's the mountain where Moses meets the Lord. Yeah. That can be, it could be a title, that Moses is applying like back on it. Yeah, looking back. So, let's say, because we see the same thing happening in Genesis 22. It's clearly that name has been added later on. But it's the mountain of God because that's where God is, right? That's where we met God. Let's consider, though, what kinds of things we might expect from this kind of, this interaction. Because, all right, first off, what is the whole point of sending Abraham to Moriah? Right, if we think back to Genesis 22, what's God's point in sending Abraham to Mount Moriah with his son Isaac? I mean, Moses tells us in the very first verse what he's doing. No, I mean in Genesis 22. Well, that's what Moses has done. Yeah, I'm talking about Abraham. Yeah, sorry. So the whole point of God sending Abraham to Mount Moriah is to test him. Yeah, now Moses is going to get the 10 Commandments, but it is going to be, in fact, the whole Exodus experience is going to be a period of testing. And we're going to see that as we continue reading through the text, that God leading them through the wilderness to establish a covenant with them is going to be a form of testing for them. And we get that cue pretty early on. because God is testing Abraham at the mountain through what he's about to do. We also get, and I think this may be the more clear and immediate connection, let's see, if you go to Genesis 22, verse 15. All right, so this is after God has said, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. In verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. All right, so because of what Abraham does in this encounter on the mountain, God repeats his covenant promises, and he says it's all because of your obedience. All right, now, we're going to hold on to that thought, and we're also, by the way, going to hold on to a point of comparison that is not yet present. All right, what Abraham has to do on the mountain is sacrifice his only son, the son of promise. We don't see a similar situation with Moses yet, but just hold on to this detail. That we're going to see if something threatening happens to Gershom sometime soon in the text of Exodus, just like there is a seeming threat to Isaac. All right, but this text in Exodus chapter 3 also reminds us of Jacob. All right, because first off, we're told in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1 that Moses is keeping the flock of his father-in-law, right, which is what Jacob's job was. Yeah. We get an appearance from the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord also appears to Jacob at various points. In fact, in Genesis 28, we see many angels of the Lord appearing to him. There's also, why does Moses have to take his sandals off at Mount Horeb? It is holy ground. And this is something that we see especially in Jacob. Go back to Genesis 28. And let's just read this encounter that Jacob has with God. This is as he's on his way to Paddan Aram. Exodus chapter 28, verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. And taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Excuse me. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid. And he said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And in fact, the name of that place becomes Bethel, house of God. All right, so Jacob recognizes that he is in a very, very special place. He does the same thing at the beginning of Genesis chapter 32. Right, the very first verse, Jacob went on his way. This is when he's fleeing from Laban, on his way to go see Esau. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which means two camps. So his camp and God's camp. And then, of course, later in the chapter, verse 22, he wrestles with that stranger overnight. And if we skip down just for the sake of time, go to verse 30, Genesis 32:30. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." And we should also remember, by the way, in verse 27, Jacob asks, "What is your name?" Or I'm sorry. Verse 29, Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. All right, so remember, Jacob there asks for the name, and he's not given the name. Right, let's store that in mind as well. So let's finish by just returning briefly to Exodus chapter 3. And we're just going to read those first 6 verses again. I think I forgot to read verse 6 last time. And we should see a lot of these echoes of Jacob coming out in the text. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, "I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. All right? And remember, that's what Jacob names the place where he wrestles with the Lord, Peniel, because I have seen God face to face. That's what Peniel means, face of God, and yet I have lived. All right, so we can already see that they're stacking on lots and lots of big, important comparisons on what is happening to Moses here in Exodus chapter 3. So we will advance this, Lord willing, on Sunday, and we will see what God has to say to Moses and what Moses has to say back to God. Thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening.